Vietnam and United States promote business ties. Prospects for state-owned enterprise equitization in 2016 to 2020. Hello, it's good to see you again on another episode of B-Line brought to you by VTV International. You're with me, Linh Hương. As usual, we start our show with several highlights in the economic scene from the past week. Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng witnessed the signing of several deals between the United States and Vietnamese businesses on the sidelines of the special ASEAN-US Summit on Tuesday. The Bank for Investment and Development of Vietnam, or BIDV, signed an agreement with the MetLife Life Insurance Limited Liability Company on expanding life insurance business in Vietnam. Also during the signing ceremony, Vietnam's Biển Đông Seafood Limited Company and Thai Group signed deals with the U.S. H2 Origin Seafood and Hyatt Hotel Corporation. Biển Đông Seafood and H2 Origin Seafood will work together to bring seafood sales in the U.S. market to more than $300 million over the next 3 years. Meanwhile, Thai Group and Chicago-based Hyatt agreed to build a $165 million Park Hyatt Hotel in Hanoi. The 300-room hotel is expected to be operational in 2018. Vietnam ranks 82nd in 2015's Global Talent Competitiveness Index, which has been recently published in Davos, Switzerland. This index assesses the ability of countries to provide high levels of prosperity to their citizens. Countries atop the list this year include Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, the United States, and Denmark, all of which have globally leading per capita GDP. Singapore is the only Asian country in the top 10 thanks to its openness to business and high living standards. The United Nations World Food Programme hopes to strengthen its long-term partnership with Vietnam, according to a representative of the WFP on February 12th. The comments were made in the Italian capital of Rome while receiving the credentials of Vietnamese ambassador to the WFP, Cao Chính Thiện. The organization has called for Vietnam's further contributions to WFP policymaking and experience sharing on the efficient use of WFP aid and natural disaster mitigation efforts by sending Vietnamese experts to engage in WFP's activities when asked. The WFP currently is the largest source of non-refundable aid among the United Nations members for less developed countries. Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are considered the most investor-friendly cities among 10 Asian destinations, according to a survey conducted by the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade. The poll released on Monday also found out that 22.2% of the respondents said Ho Chi Minh City has skilled workers and a large pool of potential workers. Up to 53.7% of the surveyed expect that the investment climate in Hanoi will be improved, while 51.6% expressed the same hope for Ho Chi Minh City. The Vietnamese cities were followed by China's Chengdu, Shanghai, and Qingdao cities. The other surveyed destinations are New Delhi, Mumbai, and Chennai in India, Yangon in Myanmar, and the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. Many textiles enterprises have orders for the first and second quarters, and some even to the end of 2016, according to the Vietnam Textile and Apparel Association. Orders and export markets for the first months of 2016 are relatively stable. In January, the textile industry achieved a high growth rate with the production index up to 12%. The apparel industry production index rose to 11.2% compared to the same period last year. However, some of the firms are experiencing delays in restarting production following the Lunar New Year holiday. Despite the global drop in the price of gold, domestic gold prices continue to rise to meet high demand on Thursday, or the 10th day of the Lunar New Year, or the God of Wealth Day. Folklore has it that buying gold on this day, when the God of Wealth returns to heaven, will bring good luck and prosperity throughout the year. In the early hours of trading, state-owned SJC's buying and selling prices stood at $1,490 and $1,508 per tael, a $4 increase from the previous morning. At about the Ningqiu Gold and Jewelry Company, buying and selling prices are about $9 higher than the same time on Tuesday. However, Asia's gold prices in the world market are still declining, making world gold prices lower than the domestic price by $53 to $58 per tael. Those are several economic and business highlights from the past week. Up next, we'll talk about the prospects for Vietnam's SOE equitization in 2016 to 2020 in our crosstalk. Vietnam set a goal to equitize 527 state-owned enterprises or SOEs between 2011 and 2015. However, until November last year, according to the Ministry of Finance, the country has only equitized a total of 397 SOEs, or meeting 70% of the target. Having said that, the result is deemed more positive than the previous 5 years, when the equitization process met only 30% of the target. Besides, the government has also announced plans to withdraw capital from such two big corporations as FPT and Vinamilk. So what are the prospects for SOE equitization process in the coming 5-year period? Let's find out more about this topic with Mr. Sebastian Eckert, an economist at the World Bank Vietnam. And thank you very much for being here with us in our show today.
Thank you for having me.
Our first question is, what is your overview of the equitization process of Vietnamese state-owned enterprises in 2015 in particular, and the period between 2011 until 2015 in general?
Well, as you mentioned, if we look at the entire period, the achievement falls slightly short of the initial target, but it's notable that progress has really picked up in the last year, in 2015, when more than 200 SOEs were actually equitized, and that actually allowed the government to almost meet the target. So I think it's very notable progress. In addition to the sheer quantity of transactions that have been completed, I think we also saw that there were some really big enterprises among those newly equitized SOEs, and that's, of course, those big enterprises. They are the most complicated and the toughest nuts to crack. So that's also a positive development, but obviously there are some challenges going forward that remain.
Which sector achieved the most significant results in terms of SOE equitization process during this period?
Well, we see that one of the biggest contributor to, in terms of quantity, but also in terms of the quality of transaction, has been the transport sector. And notably, of course, one of the most watched transactions is Vietnam Airlines. That was initiated in 2014, but really completed last year. Vast majority of transactions, obviously, are much smaller companies, and there's been many of them that have been completed, including some of which actually under the ownership and management of provinces as opposed to the central government.
2 years ago, Vietnam Waterway Construction Corporation stood on the brink of bankruptcy. However, after selling 30% of its shares to strategic investors, the company successfully sold all of its shares during its IPO. Thang Long Joint Stock Corporation's first IPO sold 12 million shares at a price that was double the starting price. This success was attributable to its selling 20% of its shares to strategic investors beforehand.
Nhà đầu tư chiến lược của chúng tôi khi tìm kiếm là một tổ chức tài chính, tổ chức ngân hàng. Đây cũng là một cái yếu tố tác động rất lớn đến cho các cái cổ đông khác. Tổ chức tài chính là sau này cũng có những cái hỗ trợ và tác động rất là tốt cho cái việc hoạt động sản xuất kinh doanh.
Last year, 7 corporations in the transport sector sold all of their shares to strategic investors before their IPOs. These turned out to be a success.
Trong quá trình chúng ta IPO thì họ thấy rằng đã có cái cổ đông chiến lược thì nó sẽ tác động tâm lý rất là tốt, vì họ nhìn thấy là cổ đông chiến lược là những doanh nghiệp quy mô tài chính tất cả nguồn lực lớn mà đã tham gia thì họ phải có một sự nghiên cứu rất là kỹ, thì các nhà đầu tư khác sẽ tham gia vào sâu hơn, và chính là đấy là một trong những cái yếu tố mà giúp chúng ta thành công qua những đợt IPO.
137 state-owned enterprises under the Ministry of Transport have successfully been equitized, while only 70 of them needed to be equitized to meet the state's target. Addressing a conference reviewing the 5-year restructuring of state-owned enterprises held by the Ministry of Transport on December 9, 2015, Deputy Prime Minister Vũ Văn Ninh affirmed that the Ministry of Transport is the first agency to have succeeded the equitization plan set forth by the government.
Có những cơ chế chính sách qua thực tiễn triển khai, trong đó có cái thực tiễn của Bộ Giao thông Vận tải đã chuyển thành cơ chế chung. Ví dụ như bán vốn theo lô, là trước đây chúng tôi đã cho thí điểm một vài nơi, nhưng mà Bộ Giao thông là người mà đề xuất nhiều nhất. Chúng tôi đưa ra chính phủ thảo luận và bây giờ hiện nay là thành quy định chung cho cả nước thực hiện.
Deputy Prime Minister Vũ Văn Ninh also suggested the Ministry of Transport focus on equitized SOEs that have not reached the target proportions, as well as enterprises facing difficulties in equitization, like Shipbuilding Industry Corporation and Vietnam National Shipping Alliance. So you mentioned a little bit about the equitization process of Vietnam Airlines. So how about other big state-owned enterprises?
It's been great, and also they've managed to attract strategic investors, including foreign investors. Of course, these big enterprises, by their very nature, are more attractive to foreign investors than some of the smaller companies. So this is all very good. Now, I think having said all these positive things, I think one of the challenges we see is that despite the large number of transactions that have gone through the system, many of them only involve very small shares that are actually divested, and in many of the equitized companies, the state capital share is still large. And obviously, in terms of the benefits of equitization and the ultimate goal in terms of improving the performance of these enterprises and the financial viability of these enterprises, what is often important is, of course, to have strategic investors that not only bring in a significant investment, but also essentially improve the management and that require of the company, and that requires these investors to obtain controlling stakes in the companies.
What have been the challenges when a state company goes through the equitization process?
So I think there are two broad challenges. One is the market environment, and obviously, especially if we go back to 2011, the macro environment was very challenging. It was a very turbulent time. The economy was not doing that greatly coming out of the sort of global financial crisis and so on. And that's, of course, not a very good environment to equitize, and in particular to divest from assets, because that's not the time when you get attractive prices, and obviously that's important. There's been some improvement, and I think that's also why you see this acceleration starting in 2014, but then really in 2015, which coincides with a period when the economy was improving. So that's one. The second one is essentially the process itself, and there's been a lot of efforts, I think, by the government to streamline, improve, and remove some of the bottlenecks to the equitization process itself, to streamline the administrative procedures, to change the way companies are evaluated. Now it's in principle possible to divest companies below book value, which is a major change and a very important one, because obviously the divestment is driven by market perceptions of the value of the company, which might not be the same as the book value. So all that is positive, but there has to be a but at the end. Of course, still, while, for example, valuation below book value is possible in principle, in practice it's still very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. Administrative procedures also still involve a lot of very centralized decision making, including decisions that have to go up all the way to the prime minister level or to the people's committee if provincial companies are concerned, and those of course make it a bit cumbersome for investors to engage on equitization.
This is the second time Bintech Real Estate Company has been listed for equitization. Progress is slow due to challenges in company valuation. Many of the projects the company invested in over the past 20 years still lack legal documents.
Thời gian hoạt động công ty kéo dài nhiều năm thì công ty thực hiện nhiều cái dự án và phần lớn đa số các dự án thì cái thủ tục pháp lý nó chưa có đầy đủ, mà chính vì cái thủ tục pháp lý chưa đầy đủ như là những cái dự án thiếu quyết định giao đất, chưa có quy hoạch, rồi chưa bàn giao hạ tầng, nó sẽ khi đưa qua để mà xác định giá trị doanh nghiệp thì nó xảy ra cái tình trạng là một số cái chỉ tiêu tài chính nó không định được một cách chính xác.
Putting a price on state-owned enterprises has become a headache due to various issues, such as unsolved bad debts and liabilities, as well as brand value.
Tình trạng kém minh bạch về tài chính của các doanh nghiệp đó, nó là một rào cản rất là lớn. Đấy, tức là các doanh nghiệp nhà nước này của chúng ta từ trước đến nay họ hoạt động không tuân theo một cái chuẩn mực về kế toán, về tài chính và về quản trị. Nay khi họ cổ phần hóa, họ buộc phải chuẩn mực hóa những cái yếu tố đó mới có thể bán cổ phần ra công chúng được, thì họ gặp rất nhiều thách thức.
Cái giá trị thương hiệu, nhất là những cái doanh nghiệp mà có cái lịch sử lâu đời, thì hiện nay cái công tác định giá thương hiệu của Việt Nam cũng chưa phát triển, và có thể nói là rất dễ có những cái sự tranh chấp trong quá trình định giá này.
The government has issued new policies to resolve these problems. For example, if bad debts are difficult to evaluate, the debts can be transferred to the parent company or sold. However, some ministries and departments have not worked effectively to overcome obstacles.
Now, regarding SOE equitization, the industry and trade sector did not record a very positive results last year. Could you pinpoint the reasons?
Well, it's difficult to say. I think part of it is also that you had a deliberate effort in certain sectors to push, and maybe less so in other sectors. Then again, the market environment plays a role as well, because in some ways I think the government is choosing sectors where they perceive there is a likelihood that they will succeed. So I think I wouldn't necessarily attribute this specifically to performance in that sector. I think part of it is actually a deliberate strategy by the government to push in certain sectors and maybe less so in others.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think about foreign investors' interest in Vietnamese SOE's equitization process for the past 5 years?
Right. I think there is, I mean, we're talking also occasionally to private sector and equity firms and so on. I think there is generally a lot of interest in the Vietnamese market, generally speaking, because obviously Vietnam is an economy that is doing really well, and I think a lot of investors see upside. So the interest is there, but of course capitalizing on that interest requires then also to put in place a conducive environment and making it easy for investors, allowing market forces to come to play, removing some of these restrictions that also still exist in terms of foreign participation, ownership participation in certain companies or certain sectors. The government has of course put in place has removed principally restrictions, foreign ownership restrictions, also last year in a very important regulatory change. But again, principally possible, implementation is another question. And so far we haven't really seen, I think, the full potential of foreign investment. We have, of course, in Vietnam Air, for example, there has been foreign participation, as you know, but I think there's much more potential that could be capitalized, especially as the government is moving forward with big and attractive SOEs. We heard about Vina Milk and so on. Those are big and attractive investment, and I think they will garner a lot of interest from the market.
Around 500 state-owned enterprises will be equitized according to the government's 2016-2020 target. According to Raymond Mallon, Senior Advisor for the Vietnam-Australia Collaborative Project, restructuring for a more competitive Vietnam, this is feasible given the strong commitment across ministries and companies. However, quantity is not as important as the goal of the equitization process, which is to improve the country's productivity and economic growth. The coming period will target large state companies, which hold a degree of monopoly.
Just transferring a state monopoly to a private monopoly doesn't guarantee you maximum benefits to the country. You've got to think about the need to really develop strong independent regulators. You need an independent competition agency. You need to think about an independent transport regulator. All these things are very important.
To guarantee fair competition, there needs to be a certain level of public involvement as part of equitization, especially when it comes to selling off part of a monopoly in key sectors.
It's just not, you're not just trying to maximise the returns from the sale, you're also trying to make sure that that industry develops, because it's very important for other industries. You know, your seaports are critically important for all your exporters, so they have to make sure, or have a voice in the process to make sure that there's the right degree of regulation and competition.
The state-owned enterprise equitization process will be subject to greater pressure in the coming period, fueled by Vietnam's economic integration through free trade agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP.
Vì một trong những yêu cầu quan trọng nhất của TPP chính là đảm bảo cái yêu cầu bình đẳng thực sự giữa doanh nghiệp trong nước và nước ngoài, doanh nghiệp nhà nước với doanh nghiệp tư nhân. Cho nên các cái đặc quyền, các cái ưu đãi, rồi những cái sự bất bình đẳng giữa doanh nghiệp nhà nước và doanh nghiệp tư nhân sẽ bị loại bỏ, nếu không sẽ bị kiện hoặc là sẽ bị loại khỏi cuộc chơi. Và đây chính là một trong những cái thể chế mà nghiêm khắc nhất và một cái áp lực mạnh mẽ và thực chất nhất để mà giúp quá trình của nó đi vào thực chất và đẩy nhanh hơn trong thời gian tới.
What do you think about the SOE equitization targets for the coming 5-year period?
Well, I think the targets are ambitious. Again, I think the target is around 400 additional enterprises over the next 5 years. But ambitious, but probably realistic if we look back. I think it is possible. I think, of course, a lot will also depend how the market environment develops, which is always hard to foresee. But if current trends persist and the overall macro situation remains stable and the government continues these efforts to streamline procedures, to remove restrictions, I think it's certainly realistic to achieve that target.
What is the global and regional economic context that can help the government achieve this goal or make it harder?
Well, I think, let me start domestically. I think domestically, clearly the economy has been improving. We saw stronger growth numbers last year. We see low inflation. There are structural constraints in terms of the depth of the stock market, which comes back to the earlier question also about foreign and non-resident investor participation. Of course, the domestic market is still relatively shallow, and the absorptive capacity is limited. So you pushing a lot of transactions and then also potentially increasing the private share in those equitized companies all at the same time, I think will run into limitations in the sense that there's just not enough investment demand just locally solid. Now globally, of course, there's, as you know, there's a lot of risks in global markets. Markets are very volatile, and of course that affects global investor sentiment. Globally, I would rather say it's probably we are headed for a difficult year with all these developments in global financial markets that suggest that there will be more volatility going forward, and that's usually not a very good environment to do these kind of divestments and equitizations.
What was done well in 2015 that could and should continue in 2016 in terms of SOE equitization process?
Well, I think the continued focus not only on equitization but generally on SOE reform, because equitization is only one part, a very important part, but I think there's many other things like corporate governance, improving transparency, including also reforms of accounting and financial reporting, because that's very important even to prepare for ultimate equitization and divestment, because all of that improves the transparency of the companies. It makes it easier for investors to understand the true value of these companies. So I think that multi-pronged approach that the government has taken, on the one hand doing equitization, on the other hand also improving the management of those SOEs that for now remain in state ownership, is a strategy that has worked well.
What are the experiences in terms of SOE equitization and also SOE reforms that similar economies in the region have gained that Vietnam can learn from?
So I think if you look in the region, of course, the example that one can easily point to is China, which also has a large segment of the economy that is state-owned and has also a lot of state-owned companies in commercial sectors like Vietnam. It's not only in, say, utility sectors and so on, but also in like really sectors that in other countries are essentially fully private. You actually see that focuses, of course, on enterprises that produce private commercial goods. Those usually the ultimate goal is divestment. And then at the same time, identifying, of course, strategic enterprises or enterprises that operate in sectors such as utilities, power sector, power transmission, where the government will retain ownership. And there I think that the agenda is slightly different. It's more about ensuring separation of regulatory and ownership functions in the state, ensuring that where possible you introduce elements of competition, you improve performance incentives for those SOEs so that even those enterprises that will remain in state ownership, they become more efficient and higher performing.
Mr. Sebastian Eckert, thank you very much for sharing with us in this live today.
Thank you.
Reforming the state sector is, of course, not only about the quantity. What is more important is to make sure that the purpose of equitization can be achieved. That is to transfer assets to private sector and changing the ownership structure in businesses to pave the way for their development. Vietnamese government has underscored the importance of speeding up SOE equitization in the period between 2016 and 2020, given clear regulations on the process. And that's all we have for this episode of East Line. Thank you very much for being with us. To rewatch our show, simply log on to vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. From our team here in Hanoi, until next time.